This is BS on Broadcasting. David Brody, a former national radio host and talent coach with 4 decades in the industry.
You gotta understand what the score is and where you are in the game.
And Marc Serber, a commentator who's called and hosted soccer matches for leagues and competitions around the world.
Real panic defending from DC United and continues here. And the beat is finally beaten. It's the opening goal for Chivas USA.
Together, they're on a mission to help every broadcaster be their best by learning from the best. And always talking BS. Brody, Serber on Broadcasting.
Welcome to BS on Broadcasting. Marc Serber alongside talent coach David Brody and Sean Meadow. And of course, our motto is to help all broadcasters be their best by learning from the best. And we are joined by Mike Watts. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We know that you have a game tonight and 3 games tomorrow. So my first question for you to kick off this podcast is how?
The magic of technology, albeit none of the 4. But it's all during the week, trying to get caught up and, reading as much as you can and talking to coaches. And I mean, it's you got to be organized because 8 teams, and I've only seen one of them or had one of them this season so far. So you're basically starting from scratch, and 2 of them are expansion teams, and you want to effectively tell that story. And the game in USL tomorrow is maybe the league's preeminent rivalry. So you want to be totally prepared for that. But either way, I'll manage. I'm just glad to be in the presence of guys who definitely have already missed the mark of this podcast, because you're not learning from the best, but you're learning from someone.
I think that, love the humbleness, but I've had the honor of getting to work with you and, do tremendous work. And I think, your resume speaks for itself. You can have all the people say good things about you and bad things about you, but in this industry, if you keep getting work, you must be doing something right. And so, my question to you is, you do football, you do soccer, radio, TV. How do you kind of make those transitions? And what would you say is kind of the biggest transition that you have to make from going from TV to radio in terms of how you go about calling the game?
Sure. I mean, for one, let's talk about the TV to radio thing first, I guess. I largely was off radio for 6 years. And when I was at Fordham, I did a ton of the football games. I really didn't do a lot of the basketball. I did a lot with the women's basketball team that was online, so did a ton of streams, but I only did 2 games of basketball on the radio before I left Fordham. I graduated early. There were seniors ahead of me. So for me, really, football was where most of the eggs were in my basket. And I thought I was pretty solid at it, but in terms of getting a radio job coming out of school that does football, you're either moving out of market or, if you get an NFL team, that's great. But I mean, you're probably not going to. I certainly didn't. So, with football, it was, hey, can I get some ESPN 3 games? And I got in with ESPN and Stoss Hall doing college soccer. And I said, hey, I've done football. I know I can do a good job with this for you. And that led to some ESPN work, which led to, after 2 or 3 years, the Bengals position came open for their preseason TV. Okay, a real long shot. A couple people who I really didn't know kind of went to bat for me did. And that led to getting, a TV, gig in the NFL, which is wild at age 25. And then last year with COVID, Dan Horde is a close contact, the great radio voice of the Bengals. They need a fill in for that. So for the first time in 7 years, I'm doing football on the radio, and it's the Bengals and the Giants, which is crazy. So that was the tape that got sent to Westwood One that had me call college football this year, including the SEC championship game. So I took a really roundabout way of getting back to radio. It's so much more description. It's being aware that no one can see time and score, for one, which is the first thing you want to hear on a broadcast. And we get locked into, every minute detail of what's going on in front of us. but we often forget the thing that's most obvious. So, right off the bat, it was, how do I make sure I keep doing that effectively? And in TV, you get a little more time potentially to look down at your board and see who caught the ball, and no one's going to really call you out for it. On radio, if you're late on that, you're late on the entire play. So it's a little more memorization, less fact finding for me at least. From an opportunity standpoint, the fact I got into radio was kind of happenstance. You just have to, get lucky enough to have a situation come up, and thankfully, Dan was okay, but then just try and have a good game with it and see where it takes you.
Mike, as you were going through the hiring process with the Bengals, did you not tell them that you're from Cleveland?
The
read about that. It's like, does that ever happen?
Yeah, the lead in the article that came out, 25-year-old making debut as NFL TV voice. And the first, paragraph is like, hey, if you don't like him because he's from Cleveland, we understand, which was awesome. I grew up as a Browns fan. I grew up, my family watched every Sunday. It was church at 11, and then it was the Browns at 1 o'clock, because goodness knows we never got any other time slot. So that's what we did. And there's a good chance I probably rooted against the Bengals a couple times, although in reality, I don't think we viewed ourselves as rivals in that time, because the Browns never won. It can't be a real rivalry if only one team wins. But yeah, it's a little jarring. And my spotter is my best friend from high school, and he's kind of like, I'm getting a check from the Bengals now. Should I be a Bengals fan? I'm like, look, you do you, but I'm repping it now.
And who can forget Sam Weich's infamous line? Remember when he grabbed the mic in Cincinnati? You people are not in Cleveland.
There's the facade of the stadium actually has a picture of him with that quote, which is amazing. Yeah.
Right. Quick question for you. In reading your bio, I noticed that you did 250 games in high school. School. First of all, how were there 250 games to be involved in? And secondly, how were you able to navigate all that? I assume that you took some classes as well.
Yeah, right. And look, I went to Fordham and got a finance degree. So from a class perspective, I really didn't study to be a broadcaster. I did it by doing it. And personally, I think there's a lot of things that carry over from my philosophy class, my English class, my finance classes that can help you, whether it's running your own business or how you, how well read you are and how you can connect that with what you're doing. So I think all that carries value. But, in high school, I was a terrible football player for a really great program. I was never going to see the field. So, realistically, I injured my back when I was a sophomore. I slipped and fell and probably would have been out of the weightlifting program for 3 weeks or a month. And I'm like, I wasn't good anyway. So there was a teacher, Bill Schmolt, who knew the guy who had started the broadcast club, who's still in the industry, Brendan Gulick, and Brendan reached out and said, hey, not sure what you're doing this spring, but I'm a senior. I just made the baseball team. We need to do the baseball games. You want to give it a shot? And that led to doing football and then basketball. And our soccer team was top ranked in the country. So did all the soccer matches, and you travel with the teams, and 250 games basically means you're in season the whole year and you're just following the teams around. And I had a good time with it.
Mike, Mike, I'm a big fan of your work, and something I've really wanted to understand, because I did this, was going from college into the professional work. And for the first time, I was doing things remotely, and the pandemic hit, and then it started to make sense. People are doing things remotely, but just how prep worked was a lot different. My first game I did, I was completely caught off guard. I was like, I did prep. the same way I was doing university soccer games. And all of a sudden I'm doing a professional one off of a monitor. And I was like, this is not going to work. And eventually, you know, you get used to it. But I wanted to know how that happened for you and how you prep now for games that you do in person in the actual stadium versus when you're doing something remotely, or like this weekend with 3 in a day.
Yeah. So for one, I'm currently in my glass case of emotion. This is the booth down at Vista World Link. So I'm already in my booth for game one. Prep wise, I don't know that it changes a ton. I mean, I've told this story before, but long story short, I was doing my first Remy and the analyst had called out, and this is 2016. It was our USL ESPN3 game of the week. And the game was in Pittsburgh. We didn't have control of the cameras. We were just taking a feedback from Pittsburgh, adding graphics and announcer, and sending it to ESPN. So I guess I'd be 23 at that point, just out of school. And, you know, game goes okay. You know, guy got hurt in the middle, which was a little weird, but, you know, game was fine. Well, I had Pittsburgh the next week, and the guy who got hurt was actually, you know, tackled by a guy in a way that earned him a red card. It was the captain of Pittsburgh's team got a red card. I never knew that. You can't see all 11 players in frame at the same time. We didn't have, you know, statistics feeds the way we do now from Opta. I'm on my own, and they never showed the guy actually getting a red or leaving the field. They showed a kid eating a hot dog and whatever. So right off the bat, you know, if you have any way of connecting to the venue, if you do a basketball game, it's pulling up live stats. In soccer, it'd be Opta. Some way of trying to have almost double confirmation of substitutions of, you know, if it's unclear who scored, and occasionally that happens, you know, that kind of stuff is invaluable. In terms of calling the game off monitor, call what you see and don't assume anything outside of it. You don't get to see the 3 runs happening 25 yards upfield. I think that was Jen Cooper, NWSL human thesaurus dictionary encyclopedia and all that. But yeah, the big thing is just trying to follow what's in front of you, knowing full well there are things that are outside of your current vision or view that you just have to deal with as they come. You're not going to see all the runs forming. That's usually where in person I'm going, okay, there are 3 people running out in front of this one person with the ball. Now I'm looking to identify where that pass is going in advance almost by trying to ID all 3 players. And you might call the entire scoring play based off being able to ID those 4 35 yards from goal. So that first pass and maybe a cutback ball, maybe you know who all 3 players are because you ID'd them way back there and followed their runs. You can't always do that when you're off site. JP Della Camera gave me a lot of good advice. Look for colors of cleats. Look for a difference in hair. Sometimes the camera vision isn't the same as your vision there, in the sense that lights come down and hit the jersey number and they might be a little shiny and you literally can't read the numbers. So, you know, sometimes it's as simple as just trying to find physical identifiers of different people to try and make it easier, especially on the far side of the field. So prep is similar. I definitely make an effort to know a little more about the venue. If it's a historic venue, why? You know, I did a game at Arrowhead. First thing I did was walked the concourse, the entire stadium. I saw their little Hall of Fame display. Those are things you can only get by being there. But if I'm calling the game off site, I'm going to put a little more effort into knowing that kind of stuff, getting in touch with coaches in advance, calling PR people in advance, because you can't just walk 30 feet to the other side of the press box. Then give yourself the best chance come game time to be ready to go.
That's great advice. Something I also always wonder about is just color commentators. You have analysts who are different for game to game. And I'm not sure if you're in the same room as them every time, or if it's, you know, something where you're not, because I've done it where I'm not in the same room as the person. And so I can't like hit them with a pencil or wave at them and say something. like it's tough. So I just was curious how you navigate that and just go about getting the calls right with those moments.
Yeah, and by the way, that was former Manchester United goalkeeper Gary Bailey. It's like weird
Legend.
who we rub shoulders. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, a lot of ways to try and approach that. Gary totally stole my concentration, believe it or not.
I mean, he does it. That's just what he does. He's so imposing.
I can't believe it. Can we sort of reformat the quick Gary?
It's cool. We're keeping this in because it's fun. And this Gary Bailey is actually my dad's favorite player growing up was Gary Bailey because he was.
I can't wait to tell him that. So I feel bad because your dad watched soccer in black and white.
Yeah, he listened to him on the radio first. He saw him in person in South Africa the first time he saw him, so he knew him from way back or knew of him. He never met him or anything, but yeah. So when we first saw him on BN, actually, sidebar, it was definitely a wait. What the hell is he doing in the U.S.? But
amazing.
Anyway, the question was about people like Gary. Like you're in the same room, not in the same room, color commentators, just how that goes for you.
Yeah, or you have Gary Bailey one day, and then all of a sudden you had to deal with me calling a game with you the next. How do you just deal with all the different commentators, from game to game within one day, let alone, over years?
Yeah, for sure. So again, there's a lot of ways to go about it in terms of how you deal with people, especially in a Remy. When you're on site, usually the window's open in front of you. When you talk, it's not as obvious because it's not bouncing off the walls. So if you hit the cough button and even want to have a discussion or hit talk back to your producer, when you're in a room that's not very well padded, there's a good chance the other mic's going to pick up on it. So just from a communication standpoint, it's difficult. I've done games from my living room for ESPN, that I worked with an analyst 1,000 miles away. We had talk back between each other, a line just between us. And I might sort of go, hey, do you want to talk about this or not? We sort of were able to create some of that, but there's the inevitable stepping on each other just because 100%, little elbow, little look, a nod. Now with COVID, it used to be we sat side by side in these rooms. Well, now they put up a plexiglass divider, which, in some cases will probably go away sooner than later, we can hope. A plexiglass divider, and they put the analyst at another table behind me. So for me to look eye to eye with my analyst, I have to turn all the way around and make eye contact. Well, now I'm not anywhere near looking at the field anymore. So you got to pick your moments to do that. And it's complicated, and yet I've been lucky for the most part. There are very few analysts I've ever come into contact with where we didn't get on pretty quickly. To sort of go to Mark's point, Gary is a banter guy. He loves to talk smack. It doesn't matter what. If I'm eating a candy bar, he'll give me crap for eating a candy bar. He's like the healthiest eater I've ever met. And he's right. I probably shouldn't be eating that. Know him versus know Lori Lindsay, who's jovial, bubbly, doesn't, go for the banter side of it much at all, versus a, analyst like Devin Kerr, where, he just loves to get involved in the game. But I know his wife and his son, and I've been around him. We'll do our 200th game in July, I think, together, which is pretty crazy. But, you sort of try and stay in touch with people who you're going to work with again. And even if you don't, you just try and make sure it's a cordial relationship, that you lead by trying to be selfless within the broadcast and allow that to be your mark. And, one thing I do with analysts I haven't worked with, I'll say, tell me 3 things you think about both teams. Because at minimum, I now have 6 things I know you want to talk about. So with a new analyst, that's some of the ways I try and break the ice to make sure that it doesn't sound like I just met you 35 minutes ago outside this soundproof room in Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, it would really suck if you said, so Bob, and he goes, no, it's Bill.
I write names of analysts on the top of my sheet. Even when I've known them forever, I still write their name at the top. Yeah. My biggest fear is turning to someone and going, I know your name. I swear, it's like, there's too many games. And I did 250 games this year with probably 100 different people. You're just like, just make sure you literally get on the air clean by saying the other person's name right.
I always used to tell people back in the day when I was on air, when the game ends, first thing I do, write down the final score. Got to write that down. You have to do it because you're looking at the
scoreboard changes.
Exactly. It's gone. That's the worst part. It's gone. You're like, oh, anybody know the final score? You have to have that. Mike, I want to ask you about college, going back to the fact that you said you had a finance degree. So a couple of things I want to ask. Let's start with this, though. I have a client who is looking at schools right now, and he's asked me repeatedly, what should I be looking at? There's so many great schools. A lot of people think, well, you have to go to Syracuse. And I know Marc Serber went there. It's a great school. There's no question about that. But there are also other very good schools if you want to broadcast for a living. So you chose Fordham. Great school, no question. I used to listen to Mike Breen back in the day when he was at Fordham, did an amazing show. Why Fordham for you? And what was it about Fordham that made you say, yes, I'm going to go from Cleveland, Ohio to New York?
It's sort of multifaceted. For one, I genuinely, the stock market finance I've enjoyed it. When I was in 6th grade, I was in the stock market club. I think I won 3rd place that year. It's just, the data of it. I interned while I was in college for a guy I still stay in touch with, Jerry Getzos, who's a Fordham guy. It's something I enjoy. New York is the global center for finance. So that's one thing. I went to St. Ignatius in Cleveland, Jesuit high school. I really believe in the Jesuit concept of education. Fordham is a Jesuit university. But I also looked at the universities that weren't. I looked at Boston College, which is, but Boston University, which wasn't. For me, I felt like the finance program was good, and I really didn't know anything about the broadcast program at all, but I never intended to go to broadcast school. Well, I went probably, March of my senior year, really ran it down to the wire, I guess. Went and visited New York with my dad and looked around the campus, and I went to WFUV, and really I went to the sports info office first and said, hey, I hear sports information departments usually run the streams or the broadcasts, and so I know what the opportunities would look like. And I made these media guides in high school, and I gave those to them. I'd love to have a role. And they go, well, we're involved in that, but really you're looking for WFUV. So I go over there, I meet Bob Aarons, who's retired now, but still working with some young announcers on the side, but had been there for 15, 20 years. And he just sort of laid out the program. Look, it's, Mike Breen's going to come talk to you every year, and Doc Emmerich is going to come talk to you, which I was starstruck by. But, producers and coordinating producers and announcers and analysts and, people around the business, the head of HBO Sports came in and tried to give you a well-rounded education that way. And then you're on a 50,000 watt station in New York calling football and basketball, and it was student led. And all of that for me was like, sign me up. I'm here for that. So I always sort of knew I wanted to try something outside of Cleveland when I graduated from high school. I didn't know that I was going to stay in New York or, how I'd feel about Fordham once I was there, but I ended up getting married at Fordham Church back in July. So clearly still love the school and the institution and the people. And yeah, it sort of worked out, but it was kind of by luck that I ran into WFUV because I didn't even know the station existed before I visited.
Well, you've obviously done very, very well so far in your career, but knowing what you know now, if you could have gone back, or let's take you back, let's say, to when you first arrived at Fordham, finance degree. I mean, that you just don't hear that. Knowing what you know now, you still would have taken that path.
Yeah, and actually, Jack Corrigan, who's the radio voice of the Colorado Rockies, was a history major, and he's a St. Ignatius alum in Cleveland. I spoke to him about, hey, what do you think about different majors? And he goes, if you're practicing it, you already have a communications degree, so to speak. I have a history degree, and it's helped me fine tune, these things. And you kind of go, okay, that makes sense. And truthfully, I wanted to have a backup plan. There's no guarantee you're going to find work, or that you're going to find it soon, or that it's going to be long lasting. So, for me, it was sort of two kind of concurrent paths that if they diverged, so be it. And I'll manage that when it comes. But, I don't think I would have done anything differently, in the sense that the connections at WFUV, Ryan Rucco and Spiro Ditas were instrumental for me getting the Bengals job initially. Mike Wojciechowski is the voice of Madison Square Garden. He's the public address announcer there. He was at a Fordham game and heard me and thought, hey, he's not bad. Well, now I've done 4 Big East tournaments and a bunch of Nick games. That's one of my favorite gigs. And it's because, a Fordham guy was looking out for a Fordham guy. So I wouldn't have done anything different. There's any number of ways, from Beloit College to, Seton Hall, that we've seen announcers, Valpo, make it. But, Fordham was right for me, just like I'm sure Syracuse is right for everyone that doesn't want to have a Napoleon complex like me.
I think, what you say, though, is just so important, because I'm one of those people, and I'll be honest, I didn't really have a plan B. And you hear it over and over again, like, this business is volatile. It's hard. You don't know how long it's going to last. Like, have a plan B. But when you're 17, 18, you're just like, that's not going to be me. Like, I'm going to do it, and it's like anything else. You can read all the books and go to the best places, but, doing, first of all, like you said, doing is the most important thing. The degree, nobody ever asked me what my grade point average was. They just want the real. And the second thing was, when I decided that I need a plan B, I had to go back to school, and I didn't know, but so, like, everybody's going to, maybe won't cross that fork in the road, but, like, the majority of us will. And to have something in your back pocket, and to know that, I just think is a really important lesson. And when you're 18, 19, even 20, like, no, that's not going to be me, but, like, it's just always so good to be prepared and have that plan B. And so I tell, anybody that I can, like, hey, even if you study broadcasting, make sure you have a minor, make sure you have another path, something that can sustain you even in those times, even if you're still going, whole hog on the broadcasting. But I just think that, by you saying that, it just reaffirms that you having that in your back pocket, that financial degree, is so important. And that's not me saying don't go into broadcast journalism. I wouldn't change that either. And I loved learning about it. But A, doing was the most important thing. And B, having that, that thing in your back pocket, I just think is, like, a really great and important lesson that I wish, I had heeded. And then just kind of along those lines is you said 250 games last year, could be more, but you said around there. You obviously can't just say the same things over and over again. And how do you go through with each sport, kind of trying to find new ways to say the same thing over and over? And when do you kind of, like, step back and take stock of yourself and your work, and then try and find new ways to describe situations as they come up?
Yeah, it's difficult, because usually it's Twitter that tells me. The NWSL Challenge Cup was July 2020. I mean, that was the first sporting event that happened. So that fan base there's only one thing to watch. That was it. So I called every game but 2 of that tournament for Paramount Plus. So you're kind of looking around like, only game in town. Well, I would sort of go, this person's coming on some fresh legs, off the bench. And by the time the Challenge Cup was over, the joke was, and the person coming off had crispy limbs, which, is clever on their part, but, it's definitely a look inside yourself and realize, I probably said that too much. So, the more experience you get, the more you sort of add to your thesaurus. You try and, for me, it's more a storyline thing than it is a repetitive issue of vocabulary. That's sort of my opinion is, usually they're spaced out enough. I don't want to say every single ball through the penalty area is a cross. It's a service, ball is squared, Jones, looking for Johnson, whatever. You try and mix that up. But for me, and I'm sure there's going to be some people groaning because during the Challenge Cup, it felt like we were hitting the same points early on. You want to acknowledge that not everyone watched the last game, but you also want to acknowledge that probably half of them did. So Mallory Pugh was a big point in the Challenge Cup. What's her level, if memory serves? There were a bunch of players where it was, this is either a moment to try and make the World Cup or the Olympics, I guess it would be coming after. And you just, you want to call the game in front of you, but it also has to have context. The big one that comes to mind, Red Stars fans were not happy that we kept talking about Sam Kerr, but the Golden Boot winner for the league left the league and left the club. So that one storyline affected Kaylee Watt and Rachel Hill and Savannah McCaskill and all those players who was going to step up and be the one. So it's not to knock them and it's not to knock Sam. It's just, storylines need context. You just don't want to say it the same way every time. And you want to be respectful of the fact that you don't want to beat people over the head with it 5 times a game. And people probably felt like we did, but it was a really concerted effort to try and make it maybe twice, knowing that over 2 hours, people tune in and out. So for me, it's less vocab and more, I'll do 20 Louisville City games. Don't tell the same story 20 times. You don't need to say they've been to 7 conference finals in the last 7 years. You don't need to say, the Golden Boot winner from 3 years ago on this team tore his ACL and watched another guy be the Golden Boot winner just 2 years prior. You don't need to do that every game. Pull it out when it's appropriate and hit the storylines, in a reasonable sort of distance apart and, find different ways to package it so that, people feel like they're hearing a new story again.
Something I wanted to ask you about, because you brought it up there perfectly, is just the NWSL fan base watches like every game of the league, where I don't think you necessarily see that in Major League Soccer or USL or any other soccer league, maybe. Just how you what do you read? What do you bring in from that fan base, from reporters who cover it? How are you prepping for it from that standpoint, but then also making sure you're addressing kind of the fan who is clearly watching? And I know you mentioned it there a little bit, but it's just always fascinating to me because I'm in SoCal, my local club is Orange County SC, and I watch a game and it's great. And I'm always just like, man, that's so hard because that the people probably watching this are fans of either of these two teams. Most likely that's the majority. But then an NWSL game, that's a whole different ball game. That's a whole different league. And I mean, I watch every other NWSL game basically, and I'm sure a fan of the Chicago Red Stars is watching the Portland Thorns just as much, vice versa. And now you have Angel City and San Diego. So there's just so many teams that it's building up. But how do you kind of go for a league where everyone watches every game?
You try and stay current would be the big thing, and just, try and make sure you hit that week really well. It's a fan base that expects a lot. And I think there's an element of it being underserved historically and expecting you to get it right. And, the tough part about it is, mistakes happen. And I think they kind of get glossed over in other sports, but soccer on the whole, even down to your accent, there's a lot of heat that comes with it. I've heard directly from someone that my American accent won't fit on a certain property. And, that sucks. It's a property I wanted to do. And I, in the current leadership of, that company right now, it's just not going to happen. And that's okay. But it's being respectful. I'm a huge believer in allow players' words to come through. I don't need to repackage what Sarah Gordon did for Healthy Hood, which was a charity relating to mental health in underserved communities. She did it really well. So show her tweet, talk about her impact, and don't make it about me. It's not that I didn't. Usually when I bring a charity up on one of these, usually I think I'm in someone else's room if I had to bet.
We can.
Am I in somebody's room? I think so. Okay. We're off and running here, aren't we?
Mike was kicked out of the room that he was in. They're about to record another broadcast, but he has moved for us. And so we were just kind of discussing Sean's question about how you have to kind of handle, a league where everybody watches every game versus other leagues or other properties where maybe fans really only watch their own team and just as opposed to, maybe just 1 or 2 games a week.
Yeah. So, respect that the fans are putting in the effort to know as much as you are. Show up aware of the current circumstances around the club. I made a comment about Klingenberg, having a good game in the context of a good season. Well, the Portland fans didn't think she was having a very good season. So is this guy watching? Well, maybe I'm seeing something different than you, or maybe I'm not, but give yourself a chance to realistically have the right answer. So, do the prep, do the research, watch the games, get caught up. When you talk to coaches, that is such a luxury for us. 11 of the 12 coaches agree to be interviewed for 30 minutes ahead of every broadcast. Use that time wisely. Ask good questions. Be probing. Don't ask simple questions that are yes or no. Give yourself a different avenue to find out something you wouldn't otherwise know, and bring that to the show. Read everything. I'll Google News the team and look at everything for the past week. You don't want to get caught out. If they're doing something in their community, do that. Like I said before or after we cut, if players have initiatives, make an effort to get caught up on that stuff and bring something unique to the show. For one, bring yourself. You can call the game differently than other people do. So allow yourself that opportunity. But beyond that, also, find unique stories in unique ways. Make friends with the PR people. Those kinds of things are invaluable and they separate you from other shows. The one awkward part is everyone likes to watch the games, but when they're on at the same time, they get mad at you if you reference the score of a game that's in progress. It's like, oh, and meanwhile here it's 2-0. And they're like, I haven't watched that game yet. And I'm like, you say most people are watching every game, but it's probably like 1 in 10. Like you still got to sell the league over here. Like if a game's over, like I should be able to reference the score. So I've started saying spoiler alert a lot because it's like, okay, if you want to mute me, now's the time. It's a unique fan base and they're really passionate about it. And you show respect to that by exerting the same amount of passion in return.
One of the things that's happened in our society around the last 2 to 3 years is that so much of politics and what has been happening socially has crept into every aspect of our lives, whether we wanted to or not. And as sports guys, we really want to talk about the sports and stick to the sports, but the bottom line is sports are life. And life and sports are mixing like never before. And so a lot of tough situations have come up, and I can think of a couple that I thought you handled really well. How do you kind of deal with those situations so that you're empathetic, so that you handle them appropriately and lean into something that like 99.9% of the population would rather not have to deal with?
Yeah. There's a balance to this. I'm a big believer in no one's tuning in to hear my thoughts about this. I want to be a conduit for the players and the organizations and the coaches and the fans to an extent, to try and verbalize some of those feelings. But, there are unscripted portions to this that are really difficult. I mean, the first set of games at the Challenge Cup, most of the teams chose to kneel, and Casey Short and Julie Ertz had a moment. And the tough thing is you don't want to sensationalize. You don't want to put someone's emotion on display in a way that's trying to be clickbait, that's trying to be unsympathetic, but you also want to tell the human story of this. And Casey's pain is regrettably a story in the sense that there's a lot of people who feel that way. And Casey's emotion shouldn't be ignored or cut away from because it's unpleasant to look at. But watching someone overcome with emotion, and I can't speak to her exact emotion, but I think what a lot of us felt: anxiety, depression, anger, sadness. You want to show that in the most tasteful, graceful fashion that you can. And the regret I have from that on a personal level was I indicated in my 5 years around the league, I wish I'd never brought myself into it. The image was in and of itself something that I won't forget, and I assume the vast majority of people won't forget. Now, a lot of people have a different opinion about how that should have been handled, and I understand that that's a conversation. But to me, sport is about human, athletic excellence, period. But everything that happens around it is absolutely part of the game. So you just need to find the best possible way to convey those emotions and convey the message that I think these players want to get across. So, I still think about that moment a lot. Really difficult.
I mean, obviously everybody has an opinion. And one of the biggest things that, we say about as sports broadcasters, and, David has taught me this, and is that, it's not about you. The game should never be about you. But I thought that in that moment, saying that was okay, because I thought it punctuated, how big of a moment it was, that in 5 years of seeing this, you had never seen, something that was so strong. And so to me, you could say, and I can understand people saying, oh, you made it about you. But to me, I felt like that attitude is because, like, we've had 5 years and nothing this big or this powerful has happened. And so I thought, that actually served to like punctuate it rather than to make it about you. But I can, kind of see both ways. I think, one thing that you've been really candid about, throughout this podcast is the feedback that you get from the general public, and the things you hear and the things you read. How do you handle that? How do you know, kind of like, what do you want to internalize, and what do you know that you need thick skin to have it bounce off of, and how do you handle it so that it doesn't affect you or shake you going into the next game?
Yeah, that's a really complicated answer, because we want to talk about mental health for athletes, and we should, and it's overdue. But we should also talk about mental health of referees, of announcers, of anyone who, look, I've made mistakes that deserve to be called out. And when those happen, I need to take that on my shoulders. That's deserved. If you don't like my voice, or you're tired of hearing me call games, or there's one account that always seem to tag me and say, "Oh, great, another Mike Watts game."
I'm sorry about that.
But it takes the wind out of your sails. Like, I'm here to call sporting event. Like, this is what I love to do. Would you really go out of your way and go, "Oh, great, Alex Morgan is starting. This is the worst"? Like, theoretically, I've put in as much service to the league from an announcing perspective as anyone, except for probably Jen Hildreth, Julie Foudy, Allie Wagner, and Marissa Pilla. From a pure time in broadcast perspective of on-air announcers, I bet none of them have called as many games as I have in this league going back to 2013. I care about the league. If you think I'm here for the money, I got to tell you, it doesn't pay that great. I do it because I love the sport. I think it's a fantastic league at its best. I've stopped looking for feedback. If it comes to me, so be it. I used to look up the hashtag on Twitter for the game. I can't do that anymore. I just know myself well enough to know, even if I felt like I had a great game, it's not worth bringing myself down. If I think I had a bad game, I'm going to see one tweet that really harps on it. That's all I'm going to think about. I don't know how Joe Buck handles, he seems to take it well, and I'm sure, however many million he's getting helps, but, trending on Twitter every week for people thinking you're not good at your job, when within the industry, everyone acknowledges he is, if not the best, one of the best of all time. I don't know how you put those two together. It's really difficult. And for someone who hasn't achieved, Joe Buck, or, you can say anyone who's been at ESPN or Fox or CBS or NBC for a long period of time, a level of long-term sustained success at that level, it does make you question whether you should be here in the first place. And that's as crippling from a performance standpoint as anything. I have gained a lot more respect for what athletes have to put up with, because the further along I've gone in my career and the bigger the spotlight feels, the more I feel like I've gotten a sliver of that.
I feel like you handle it so well, though, because every game you go on, you're full of confidence, you're full of poise. So, I mean, yeah, I appreciate the candidness, because you certainly don't exude that when you come, when you get on the microphone. Again, we say we're not supposed to make it about ourselves. I'm going to make this about myself. I got to a point where, I was getting that too. And, we all get it. Look who's out of the business doing this podcast, and look who's still in it. So that says something. But, I got to a point where I decided the only people I care about that think I do a good job, I care if Brody thinks I do a good job. I care if my grandma thinks I do a good job. And I care if my producers and the people that hire me for the next gig think I did a good job. And at the end of the day, you have to block out that noise, because it's going to drive you crazy. And so, Miami or LA, or Florida, Fort Lauderdale, where you are right now, or where I was in Los Angeles at the time, if I did a game and I went to the beach, I thought, like, if people are saying terrible things about me on Twitter, but I'm sitting on the beach and I'm not online, then it doesn't, it doesn't really happen. And as long as those people were happy with that, then I'm willing to have people talking, smack about me from behind a keyboard. And don't get me wrong, there were times, especially at the beginning, where, I let that almost keep me in bed for an entire day after a bad game. But there just comes a point where you have to find a way to kind of handle that yourself. How do you kind of find a way to handle that and then go on air with the poise and the command that you have?
Yeah, it's there's a couple angles to that. Like, when I was in college, there's a Fordham message board, and someone posted this, I don't know how many page critique of my first game on terrestrial radio. I mean, harsh, guys, come on. So I still have it. The board is gone, but I PDF'd it and I've kept it. And there were some elements of it that were right. I would go, "Oh, this guy got dropped by Johnson." in the middle of the field. What a hit. Well, I didn't say where the ball was. Dropped would indicate that the ball dropped, not the human. So he's tackled at the 37, not, oh, what a hit. That's being a 19-year-old doing your first game on radio. But some of it felt over the line. So literally from the first game I've ever done on the air, I felt some element of it. But I agree with you. One of my favorite things about going home to my wife is she doesn't give a rip about sports at all. How did you do? Doesn't care who won. It doesn't faze her at all. And for me to be able to come home to that, where she loves me unconditionally, as opposed to, Twitter, which decides on a given day, what have you done for me today? Yeah, I'll worry a lot more about my family and a lot less about Twitter. Again, if it's deserved, I'll take that. And usually I know it, but there's some stuff where I can't make you feel differently about me. So why am I going to try? I'm going to go out. I started to say, my ethos on air was, let's F around and have a good time. It doesn't mean I'm not taking the game seriously. It means from a literal perspective, I'm going to laugh personally. I'm going to engage my analyst. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a fun time. And if people at home don't like that, maybe I won't get hired next time, and so be it.
I was fortunate when I was in Hartford. I worked for a great program director by the name of Charlie Parker. And one of the first things Charlie taught me was thick skin. You have to have thick skin. So when I was hosting my show, we didn't have the social media like we do now. It was emails. And I would get a lot of emails, and I would respond to everyone every night. And I would say for the first couple of years, it really affected me. I mean, I took it personally, and it affected me. I'd go home at night, you cry into a pillow and say, God, I must suck. But then I realized, you know what? Everyone has an opinion. And I learned to just eliminate the negativity. I admit one email really affected me. I got a death threat, and that affected me. When I saw that, I was jolted. But other than that, after my first couple of years, I was able to just eliminate all the negative feedback, and I responded to everyone, and I would always write, you're entitled to your opinion. I hope you enjoy the show, and just move on. Let's get off that, because I wanted to ask you about developing a style. You hear all the time, well, to be a great play-by-play announcer, you have to have an amazing voice, and clearly you do. But you also have to have a very good delivery. It helps. How did you develop your style?
A lot of that went back to college. Give Bob Aarons a lot of credit, because I'd done all these games in high school. How hard was this going to be? It's a college soccer match. I'll figure this out. So literally during freshman orientation, there's a women's soccer match at Fordham. So I went up to the press box with Bob. And I used to really want to deliver, and I go, welcome, everyone. It's Fordham soccer. And he'd go, whoa, settle down there. And that was a years-long process. I don't think anyone's ever truly found their voice. A mic, a mic in front of you is difficult. And, having it going back through your ear, you can overanalyze it if you choose to. Sometimes I keep one ear off. And when I engage someone, I look at them, and I found that draws a more conversational tone out of me. Might not work for everybody, but for me, I think I've got a decent personality. I seem to get along with most of the people I come into contact with. So, carry that on air. There's, we got a tweet ahead of a game last week about, Mike seems like a Peeps guy and Devin seems like a Cadbury egg kind of guy. And we talked about that on air. And there was a point where we both hit the cough button and laughed so hard that we almost cried. I don't know. I'd like to think someone at home probably laughed at it too. Maybe they thought we were stupid, and that's okay. But, allow your personality to be your personality. And early on it was, I need the perfect reel or ESPN's never going to hire me. And maybe that was true at the time. What I've come to find out is what they really want is how well do you storytell? How well do you engage your analyst? And how well can you allow your personality to shine? And if you do that stuff effectively, that's what moves you up. So maybe it takes the perfect reel at first, but by the end of it, that is 1/100th of the grand scheme.
Mike, you just mentioned storytelling, and that's very important, obviously, as a sports broadcaster. How do you become a great storyteller?
I don't know that I have, in part because I think the object is to be concise, and there are times where sentences go an extra 10 words in the run of play because you don't want to miss anything. And you're also you're not reading out of a book. You're still watching a game. So you don't want to get caught. To a certain extent, I'll put bullet points, what needs to be in this story. And if I embellish it with other details later, great. But if not, these 3 points need to have, some place here. I thought, I'm still really proud of the story I told about Justin Merrim at Orlando City. And he was playing for the national team overseas, and just talked about how, you go certain places, he grew up in the United States, and you go back to where your parents are from, and, you realize people are much happier with much less. I thought that was a really compelling story. So I wanted to talk about it. It doesn't mean, there weren't other details that may have been more pertinent. It was just what made it interesting to me. And that's sort of the lens of your personality. Those things really stood out to me. I just spoke to Kristen Hamilton at Kansas City ahead of the game tonight. And she told me about growing up and all the strengths she took from her mom, a single mom who worked in real estate and really had to make it happen for her to realize her dreams. And what a great story that is. Will it come up tonight? I don't know. I may not use it till next year. Doc Emmerich used to say there was something on one of his boards that had been there for 8 years. Just because you have it, I think, doesn't mean you have to use it. So storytelling to me, being concise, describing why something is interesting to you, because if it's interesting to you, it's probably interesting to someone else. And then finding the right time to use it where it's most impactful, as opposed to telling a story just because you don't have anything else to say.
That parlays perfectly into my next question. If you do your prep right, you're going to have like 5 or 6 stories you want to tell. Sometimes, depending on the game, you have all the time in the world to tell those stories. And sometimes the game's, going so well, or is at such a frenetic pace, you don't really have time. How do you balance getting in those stories and finding the right time to tell those stories with the play-by-play and making sure that you're not doing too much of one versus too much of the other?
Yeah, that was a conversation I actually had with Devin Kerr over the offseason. We do so many soccer matches together. I just said, hey man, what's something about my style that you would tweak or that I could do better? He goes, there's times where you try and fit 10 stories into a game that needs 6. And so it's, an element of a good game. You should only need 15% of your board at most. A bad game, you might need half of it. So the preparation has to remain the same because you don't know which half you're going to need. And you don't know if you're going to need 15 or 50. But, for me, it's, knowing place on the field and knowing if you have time for one, allowing the moment to give you the context in which a story makes sense. And then once you've done those two things, maybe you let it rip. There's halftime. I always look, my boards are structured in a way where every player's got their own square, the coach, the stadium, the history of the club. And then on the right side, last game, next game, 2 lines of literal 4 words or less nuggets that 6 goals scored in their first 2 games, 3 shutouts in 3 games, had none in preseason. And I usually will just say 3 shutouts in 3 games because I remember the other half. Those are triggers for me. And then beneath that, I've got the first word is bolded. It might be Lynn Family Stadium. Okay, if we show a wide shot of the venue, if we come out of halftime and it's 2-0, I may go, because I have it in front of me, Louisville has not lost a game in which it led at halftime since this stadium opened. Doesn't mean I'm going to use it every game, but I know where to look, and it's an open note test. So there are times you feel, hey, dang, I left a little bit on the table here. But most of the time, you're more frustrated, I've found, running too tight to a goal or telling a story that didn't fit, more so than leaving money on the table by not getting a story and, finding a way to finagle it into a broadcast.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The times I look back and just think, oh, like I started to tell a story, and like you should have known that ball's going down the line. There's going to be a cross. You need to lay out and let that play develop, and figuring that out. There's not a perfect formula to it, but you definitely get better and better, with each game, and just understanding the situation. Mike, we can't thank you enough for coming on, for doing this right before a game, for your candidness. We will let you go, but we have to ask you the final 2 questions that we ask every guest on our show. And the first one is, knowing what you know now, what would you go back and tell high school Mike, who's just starting out in broadcasting? What is the biggest piece of advice that you would tell him that you wish you could have had right when you started out?
I mean, it's a tie. Don't read Twitter. I mean, I really wish I learned that lesson 7-10 years prior. Back then, you don't even think you're ever going to be in a position that people will be doing that. And I guess that's 2011. I'm not sure Twitter was much of a thing, but.
Well, don't worry. For Brody, it was don't read what the mailman delivers.
Yeah, no. Yeah, don't check your email, any of it. That, or honestly, the opportunity will arrive when it's supposed to. I felt so adamant I had to be on a certain trajectory. I had to do this level of game by this time. Doing an E3 college FCS playoff game got me an NFL job. I may have skipped steps there, but I was so worried about all the different ways in which it could happen that by the time it did you really enjoy the fact that you got there? The big thing for me is just, trust that people are looking out for you, relationship build, and allow the opportunities to come when they're supposed to come.
That's awesome. And I think dovetails with this next question is, if somebody came up to you right now, they're, young, green behind the ears, and they say, hey, I want to be a broadcaster, what's the first thing that you're going to tell them that maybe you feel those who are starting out in the business aren't being told at the moment?
Yeah. For one, I'd say send your reel to David or to me or to Mark or to Sean, or, get opinions, but like, you need to take subjective critiques to heart, and you don't have to take every piece of it. But, take critiques to heart. The other thing I would tell people is it's a grind. And, for every, last year I did the Champions League final for CONCACAF in Monterey. I flew 9 hours the next day to do Ohio State, Penn State football. And the next morning I flew to do the SEC soccer tournament. That sounds awesome. If I slept more than 10 hours in those 4 days, I'd be shocked. My wife didn't see me in that span for 2 weeks. During the Challenge Cup, I didn't see my wife, then my fiance, for 6 weeks because of the way the travel was and with COVID. That's a bit extreme, but you're going to miss birthdays and anniversaries and, friends, and, you need to be committed to doing this because this is what you love to do, not because you're going to make an epic sum of money. In the play-by-play field, making $5 million a year or more, and odds are you're not going to be that person. And if you can walk away satisfied with I got to call games for a living, which a lot of people also don't get the opportunity to do. And you can handle all the things that you have to miss and give up to do it. Then it's the greatest career. But Bob Costas said once to a group of us in college, and I didn't understand it at the time. He said, they may send a car to pick you up at 5 a.m., but you still have to get in it. And I didn't get that until probably, when I got married, and I'm on the road 200 nights a year. My wife's a teacher. She can't come with me. So that's the tough thing. Get used to FaceTime, I guess would be the advice.
Mike, we can't thank you enough. That's awesome advice and wonderful insight, and really appreciate it. And good luck with is it just 4 games this weekend at the time of recording, or do you got stuff on Sunday as well?
Off Sunday, and then I've got the NIT at the Garden on Tuesday and Thursday, 2 games in Florida in between on Wednesday, and then a game on Friday and 3 more on Saturday. So saddle up. It's one of my busiest times of the year.
Wow. Well, we look forward to listening. Thank you so much again, and thank you to everybody for joining us on BS on Broadcasting.